Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I haven't been out of the house in 13 and a half years, so I'm very excited to actually see faces again. So I'm here to talk a little bit about how to brand yourselves better, which I'm sure most of you haven't really thought of. How do you think about the companies you work for, but you don't necessarily think about how you brand yourself. So what we're going to cover is just some quick do's and don'ts. I'm sure some of these go without saying, but Andrew, I teach at a college, and one of the first assignments I gave my students is to actually audit their digital footprint. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Also, how many of you have ever created your own unique value proposition? Yeah, probably most of us haven't, and most of the time when we go and people introduce us or we're starting to network again in person, people will say, so tell me a little bit about what you do. And most of the time we sort of, oh shucks, like I sort of just do some social media stuff. But we don't really talk about the value that we bring to our companies, to our clients, to our customers. And also to dominate your niche by publishing relevant content with your network, which Andrew's just covered, so maybe I'll skip through. I've got a lot of slides. Can't tell already, I talk really quickly, so we'll get right to it. So how many of you have ever Googled your name? Some of you have. Has it been in the past year or so? Yeah? That's good, because a lot of my students actually don't do that. That's, as I said, auditing their digital footprint is the first assignment that I give to them, because really it's taking a look through the lens of an employer, a potential customer, potential client, potential employer, to see how they see you through their lens, through their eyes. What I say often, and I have no idea where I can attribute this to, so I can't introduce everything, is when you're inside the jar, you can't see the label. When you're inside the jar, you can't see the label. And for me, that was just such a mind blower when I heard that statement, because most of the time we don't see ourselves through the lens of somebody else, right? But it's easy for us to promote something else, like our brands, our businesses. It's a lot harder for us to promote ourselves. But in today's day and age, I think social media, the popularization of social media, has been around for about 15 years. And so we are brands, really, because most of us are using social in some way or another. And I'm splitting hairs here. We're talking about personal branding, because that's what most people do, is talk about your personal branding. I'm splitting hairs a little bit, because I think your personal brand goes on to Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, those fun social sites, and your professional brand is what shows up to LinkedIn, is what shows up to business meetings. I'm splitting hairs here a little bit. I'm a big candidate of LinkedIn, so of course I'm going to probably cheerlead that quite a bit if you have questions about LinkedIn. Of course, I can talk about it, of course, Andrew can talk about it as well. And one of the things that I say to my students all the time is never, ever push anything ever online that you wouldn't feel comfortable seeing on a billboard. And I'm just glad, that I grew up in a pre-Google world, in a pre-social media world, where I don't have a legacy that you can find 15 years ago of my online behavior. But as my son is 15, his whole life has been in front of a camera, right? And so my students that are just a little bit older than my son forget that they have this legacy. I remember when I first started teaching and asking my students to do that, I would say to them, so Google yourself, do a full report on how are you showing up? Would you get a job based on this? And some of my students were saying, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize my MySpace account was still live. So it's really interesting how that legacy can still be there from years past, right? So again, it's important for us to Google ourselves. And some of the do's and don'ts, so some of you guys might remember the Central Park Karen. This is definitely a don't. So even in our non-working hours, we are brand representatives of our organization. So some of you might remember Amy Cooper, who was reported in Central Park for basically, I don't need to really get into the details, but she was calling 911, she's calling the police about a gentleman who was reporting her for asking her to put a leash on her dog. Anyway, Amy Cooper worked at Franklin Templeton and lost her job as a result of her behavior that happened in real life, right? Here's another one. So Haley Guthrie-Bowles, who's the vice president and senior legal counsel for CDS, lost her job because she commented, I think on Facebook, specifically, and the gist of it is that she was basically saying that the people that had been murdered in Las Vegas were country music fans, and so they, because they probably, if they're country music fans, they're probably Republicans, and so, but basically it was sort of like, well, they got what was coming to them because, the shooting that happened in Los Angeles, they got what was coming to them because Republicans haven't really said any rules and regulations for not, you know what I'm saying? Like they're a little bit more, I don't know which amendment it is because I'm Canadian, but they're right to bear arms. And she lost her job. And that was a senior president, vice president, senior legal counsel. So, and then of course, some of you that are in public relations know this is the worst do not do that happened was Justine Sacco, who published Going to Africa, I hope we don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white. Right? And you remember that story? It was a few years ago, and she thought she was just trying to be clever and funny, and this is not clever, it's not funny, and it was on Twitter, and this was a senior public relations person who then lost her job, and it's become synonymous for that behavior online, right? So we think that common sense is common sense, not always. As I said, this is a senior public relations person. We've had a CBS senior vice president of legal. So even if you're not working hours, you are a brand representative, not only for the company you work for, but also for yourself as well. And what's the brand that you want to see when you show up? So we all have to think about ourselves as being a brand and as an agency of sorts. That everything that we do, everything that we publish, even things that we think are funny or cheeky or, they might be misinterpreted by other people. And so you just have to be mindful of that our humor might not necessarily be funny to other people in the same context, right? And so I think of brands, I think of, I don't even have to tell you that on the left-hand side what those brands are without even mentioning what companies are, by their logo or by the color of the blue box, right? And the same thing goes for yourself. I mean, Oprah's a brand, Mark Zuckerberg's a brand, Albert Einstein's a brand, you're all brands as well. And so we have to be thinking about that. We have to be thinking about how do you want to show up? Part of that is building your professional presence, right? Hopefully you're on LinkedIn, because I love LinkedIn. But you really, like Andrew said, you really want to be focusing with the right audience, right? It's all the context, the right content, in the right context as well. And of course, we want to engage with insights. That's the heavy lifting, as Andrew mentioned. Content is a beast for any of you guys that are actually writing and publishing it. It just never stops, does it? The content is incredible. But you want to be seen as a thought leader in your own right as well, right? So publishing content from your own perspective is important because you are a thought leader, you are a brand to yourself. And to build those trusted relationships. So I think that's really where the powerhouse of social media has really come into play, is about building that intimacy of relationships. And so we have to be thinking about that again through the lens of who are we looking to impress? Who are we trying to connect with? And where's the future? Some of us don't necessarily future pace as to where you want to be in 5 years or 10 years' time. Can you imagine? We've only had social media, the popularization of social media for the past 15 years. Can you imagine where it's going to be in 5 years and 10 years? And where do we want to be? Do we want to be seen as somebody who is, creating great content and giving great value to our network? Hopefully you do. And really, one of the things that I have been championing for a long time is that we are all brand ambassadors for our organization as well. And I know that's sometimes hard for most of you that are working in digital marketing, because you might have those rogue staff members or team members that you're kind of like, I don't know if we want this maverick to have access to the digital channels. But at the same time, we definitely want to empower our team members to share great content, because sometimes they can be the biggest and the best advocates for our business to create, or just to at least sharing great content with our networks. And so 74% of company leaders use social media platforms to help communicate publicly. And that's what we as users, we're expecting our leaders to be using social media tools. And 82% of respondents are more likely to trust a company whose CEO and leadership engage with social media. And that is a really hard, I'm pushing a boulder uphill, trying to get people that are in the C-suite engaged in social media. Have any of you guys tried to get your C-suite involved? And most of them are like, call me. I will totally cheerlead for you, because I know how important is to get our students involved in there, but they're just not necessarily digital natives, right? And it's just really hard to get them out of their own comfort zone to be the face of the organization. I don't know how many of you have heard this quote from Jeff Bezos. It says, personal brand is what people say about you when you leave the room. And I love this quote so much, again, because we need to look through the lens of other people. It's a lot easier for our friends and our families to cheerlead us than it is for ourselves to cheerlead ourselves, to really stand in the value of what we bring to the table. Most of us haven't been raised with, tell your story, tell everybody how amazing you are. Most of the time we just sort of go, well, I just sort of do this stuff and it's not really that big a deal. But at the same time, to stand in the value of what we bring is only going to help you in your career and moving forward. So really, what is your unique value statement? If you could, probably the best way to do it, and this is why I write LinkedIn and optimize LinkedIn profiles for a living, is because what I do is typically mirror back to my clients the story that they're telling me, and the first question I often ask is, what's your why? I don't know how many of you guys have seen Simon Sinek, Start With Why, or the book. And it's such a powerful question to ask. Why did you guys decide to work in marketing in the first place? What made you decide your career path? There's usually a passion, a drive that comes behind your story. And so think about what you uniquely bring to the table that nobody else does. Because nobody knows what you know from your perspective. And I think that that's important. And most of the time we dumb ourselves down. We haven't been raised to, we don't want to brag about ourselves, right? Because who really wants to be that person? But there are subtle reframes that we can use in order to tell that story and stand in our value by saying that you're passionate about doing the work that you do. You're driven. You're there to be of service to your network. And I think that's where the reframe comes in, is when you can tell your story about saying how excited you are to do great work for other people, then it doesn't sound like bragging. And the other part is just sometimes you just have to get used to telling your story in a way. The things that we are, the bragging of things you can say, they don't necessarily come, they feel like they're bragging at first. I know the first time when I was interviewed on CBC radio and they introduced me as a social media guru, I was like, this is amazing. And then a friend of mine who worked at LinkedIn at the time, she said, you have to put that on everything. I was like, yeah, but everybody's saying I'm a jerk. And she's like, you need to put that on everything. So I went into my LinkedIn header. It's in some of the posts that I send to my clients and so forth. It's not bragging because I did it. It did make me feel very uncomfortable. It's still sometimes when people call me on the phone, they're like, is this who CBC calls a social media guru? I'm like, I am. You bet I am. But as you start to tell people or you showcase this, and here's the other great thing, when you're telling your story on LinkedIn, people are expecting to see your accomplishments on that channel. So own it. So think about your unique value proposition, who you are, what you do, how you help your network, and really where you're providing value to them. And if you can do it in such a way that provides a unique perspective, how are you different than everybody else in there? This is a little hard because we have a lot of platitudes that like, I'm a team player, or I'm really good at this. If you can quantify your value, even better. But really understanding who you are, what you do, and who you help really helps, because how many of you guys ever probably experienced this? Somebody looks on your LinkedIn profile or somebody finds it and you're like, they know your whole life. And they go, I didn't know you did that. I didn't know that. Right? Most of us don't even put those things out there for fear of judgment. It's our lovely little amygdala in our brain. That lizard part of our brain that says, you're not enough. Well, I'm telling you, you are enough. So sometimes it's helpful to go through the exercise of actually creating a unique value proposition for yourself. So an example, of course, this will be in the presentation because I'm talking so quickly, I don't have time to write it in that fast. I'm an award-winning experienced marketer who specializes in consumer packaged goods, including brands such as Nestle, Cheerios, and Nesquik, by focusing on metrics, consumer insights, influencers, and launching creative campaigns that have successfully scaled our strategy to produce quantifiable results. So think about that from your perspective, really creating a good solid story, and I'm going to talk specifically, I would use this on LinkedIn, right? So your personal brands, maybe you have to shorten things up if you're going to be representing yourself using Instagram or TikTok or any of those other channels, but you're going to have to find different ways to compartmentalize that. 220 characters, narrow that down. There's a quote by a 16th century philosopher by the name of Blaise Pascal who said, "If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter." Anybody who's a content person knows exactly what I'm talking about. To condense things down is almost impossible. If any of you are students, I also included this one. I'm a business administration student at the University of Toronto. The courses I have completed include economics, accounting, and strategic management. I understand the challenges of the current business environment, and I'm passionate about driving innovation to lead and drive sustainable change. And so I just sort of give you these two really sort of broad scope examples because this is going to help you with your writing related story or any of the other stories that you create in your value proposition. What are you driven and passionate about doing? What are some of the results that you produce? If you can quantify it, that's fantastic. If it's the brands you work with, that's fantastic. And so what makes these things unique to you? And most of the time, we don't see ourselves through that lens of the value that we're bringing to the table. So I'm here truly to tell you, you can do this. So again, I just included the slide here again. If you had more time, I would have let you go through the process of creating your unique value proposition. So what makes it unique? What is your why? What are other things you can include in your bio, in your storytelling to tell that story? Because a lot of us, again, we don't want to sort of use the generalities. I'm a great team player or anything like that. Be specific whenever possible. Have you received awards? Even if you were on a team that received awards, that's value. There's definitely value in that. I try to really share this when I'm writing a LinkedIn profile to say, I'm an award-winning marketer. People are like, oh, I don't know, it's just going to feel so uncomfortable. Trust me, you will get better at it because if I can do it, you guys can do it for sure. How many years of experience have you had? Sometimes that quantifies the difference between you and your peers. I've had over 20 years experience. I can joke and say, I have been in digital marketing in a pre-Google world. For 20 years I've been working in digital marketing, and one of my students said, well, you're a digital dinosaur. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that didn't make me feel so great, but it's not true. I've been around that long to know what it was like. I used to buy bananas. Your education. So this is where I really cheerlead my students to really encourage them to include the courses that they've taken in school or their background. Some of the education really does matter, right? The courses you've taken. So my students will be like, but I don't have that experience. I say, what do I say? Talk about the courses you've taken. Talk about the volunteer work you've done. What makes you passionate and driven to do what you do? And sometimes it's the projects you work on. Again, sometimes you cannot describe maybe the clients you work with, or sometimes you can't describe it. You can talk about the projects. What are the things that you've done to produce results? And anytime you can quantify that, as I said, is beneficial. So include those proudest moments in this proudest achievements. Again, this is, I can guarantee you, this is going to push you outside your comfort zone because every senior executive that I interview to write their LinkedIn profile will get stuck with this. When I say to them, tell me about your biggest accomplishments and your proudest moments. And I thought it was just a Canadian thing, I thought it was a female thing, and I'm finding that it's an everybody thing. That when we start talking about our biggest accomplishments and our proudest achievements, we all kind of go, well, it wasn't a team that sort of worked and did some of this. It doesn't make us feel comfortable to talk about those stories. But at the same time, if you're not sharing it, no one's going to do this for you. You have to stand in your value and tell your story. So think about those moments. And it's okay to put them out there. It's okay to say, I'm really honored to have been recognized. I'm really proud that I was able to take this from A to Z or whatever it is. And using the words, reframing the words that you're coming from a place of service is where the magic's going to happen. Because really everybody wants to work with the best. Nobody wants to work with I sort of, do the social media thing. Everybody wants to work with the person who's like, well, not necessarily the one who's like, I'm really good at what I do. Nobody really wants to work with that person. But the person who says, oh, I'm so excited to see this project come to fruition. When I did this, it was so great. And who doesn't want to work with a person who's going to get behind that and really passionate about driving success? Nobody wants to work with that person. Nobody wants to work with a person who just hung a shingle yesterday and said, well, this is kind of stuff, right? So it is getting behind your accomplishments. And if you're afraid of bragging, I don't know how many of you have heard this concept called wabi-sabi, but it changed my brain completely. This concept of wabi-sabi, from what I understand, is a Japanese art form that is really about the acceptance of the transience and imperfection. So while most of us think of ourselves as imperfect, this Japanese art form is embracing the imperfections. I was like, oh, this is great. Because even when I started talking, I said, I talk real fast, and I only have an hour, and I have like 3 songs, so go really fast. I'm also very animated, and when I have received feedback forms from events like this, hopefully most of you will say she did a great job, loved her energy, loved great information. One person I remember seeing when she wrote on it, she seemed a little manic. And I was gutted. I was so gutted. And why was I focusing on that one person who said I seemed a little manic, as opposed to the other people who found value in what I was talking about? And I had that aha moment where I was like, why am I doing this to myself? And this is the other cool thing about the podcast, is I'm listening to so many performers and actors and comedians about how much they beat themselves up on a daily basis. Have you ever heard of like some of these, like I listened to when you said Dax Shepard, I love listening to Dax Shepard. And so many celebrities, from Howard Stern to Adele, are terrified about. They always beat themselves up, and they're always terrified about putting themselves out there. I'm like, yeah, but these are the most successful people in the world, and they still have fears? Well, if that's the case, then the rest of us are pretty normal if we're struggling with the same fear. So find the beauty in the imperfections. Like, don't you find that perfection is boring? I really do. Like, just sort of perfection. So embracing the imperfections, but finding what sort of makes you unique and quirky and weird and all those kind of things, is like, embrace it. Because that's what makes you you. The things that we beat ourselves up the most for is really what makes us all unique. So if I just showed up here not being chatty and animated, absolutely minute, I'd be like, so let me tell you again today about branding yourself. You guys would be like, it's just a fork in my eye at this point. I would just want to kill myself, right? So embrace it. And then just remember that each channel has a different purpose and a different reason for being, right? The psychology for each different channel has a different reason altogether. And so you just have to remember that as you're creating content, and also just be mindful of maybe locking down those other channels, Facebook. Like if you're publishing content on Facebook that you just want to share with your friends, then make sure you optimize all of the privacy settings so you're only sharing with friends. And just be mindful of, like, if you're sharing things publicly, that is a representative of who you are, and even how you show up. So I wear these little heels. I dress like this when I'm teaching at the college as well, because this is the brand that I feel most comfortable in. I put my little high heel shoes on, little small feet, so my shoes can pay less. But I have like little itty feet with little high heels, and it's not for the students that I do it for, it's for me. It's who I show up being in the presence that I am, and I feel better about myself, and I feel like I put a little lipstick on it, so that's necessarily coming in, right? So there's a different psychology for each one of these channels. So you just have to be thinking about why you're using it, and you don't have to do it everywhere. You just have to be fish to fish are right. And that just answers the question: should you be visible on every social channel? I mean, by now, 15 years into the social media stuff, it's just marketing, right? We're not even talking about social media control anymore, are we? It's just all part of the whole marketing toolkit. At least I work with the Canadian Marketing Association, and we don't even talk about digital really anymore as a channel. It's just marketing. It's all in the same umbrella, right? So you just want to fish where the fish are. So who's your audience? Thinking about this from the perspective of when you're sharing content, whether it's LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook or TikTok, who's your audience? Who's your audience? Where are they hanging out? Of course, this is just strategy 101, right? As marketers, you guys already know this stuff. I'm just preaching to the choir. What do they want to learn? What do they want to know about? And how can you educate and entertain? More importantly than anything else is the engage piece. That's where the magic happens. How do you get people to engage? As Andrew even mentioned, it's getting harder. I think Andrew mentioned this. It's getting harder and harder to get people to engage, isn't it? Online, if you're looking for metrics. So how do you get them to feel like you're making a connection with your audience from that brand perspective? And again, from your own personal brand perspective, if that is you, if you're an influencer, if you're trying to create that influential brand, getting engagement is really where the magic happens. And whenever possible, I'm sure you guys already know this too, is own the relationships. While I love cheerleading, social media, I love it so much. I've been doing this a long time. It is like I just found, like, even when Andrew was talking about the fact that Facebook, no longer, the organic reach on Facebook is so small, people, I remember starting off and I was creating digital content on Facebook for some of my clients, and they were like, I'm gonna get rid of my website because there's this thing called Facebook, right? These channels are changing and they're constantly evolving. So if, whenever possible, from a brand perspective, you want to own relationships, drive people back to your website, drive people back to your email accounts, or to sign up to your newsletter and so forth, and use those social media channels as syndication to own those relationships. Okay, so, and then obviously you want to dominate your niche by publishing content, the heavy lifting, right? And so it's building the right audience, sharing relevant content, posting your own content, and that's where the kind of the magic can happen. Again, it's much harder to, that is such a great question. I love that you had, Sarah, about how do you get, do you just have one face of the brand, or do you try to really push people outside their comfort zone? I think if you sometimes, if you can make it fun in your organization, people might be more likely. It's not obviously the most ideal kind of camera, believe it or not. But I really don't want to be on camera. I hate having my picture taken. And sometimes it's just, again, getting people outside their comfort zone to have a little fun. And then you'll find, at least if you have one person who interviews other people, that's what sometimes I've done on the podcast that I've had. Instead of just me talking at the camera, it's talking with people and having some of my customers and my clients interviewing them, asking them about their perspective on things. It's a lot easier when you're talking with someone to be on camera than it is to sort of look into the lens if anybody has done it. So how many of you guys have actually done video stuff? It's so hard, right? Just looking at that red light on your, laptop, you're like, oh my gosh. And then trying to, like, be animated, be big, be happy, in front of the camera, where you're like, I'm just talking to a computer screen at this point, right? So that's why it's great having people come back to these events, because it is so much harder just to engage with a computer screen all the time. And the Zoom fatigue is real, people, isn't it? So educate and empower through storytelling. So I had to ask my son about some of these brand ambassadors. We're living with a 15-year-old boy. I certainly have found out about a whole world that I don't think I ever would have learned about, insofar as the PewDiePies of the world, or Jacksepticeye, or my son, when he was little, he was like Skyland's Minecraft, and all these other people. That there's a generation of people who are my age and older have no idea what I'm talking about. They have no idea who PewDiePie is, which is really remarkable when you think about it. So, storytelling is such a big piece of it. My students also have loved these the beauty storytellers, right? The Jeffree Stars of the world. I hadn't even heard of this student with over 50 million people. I never even heard of her when I created this presentation. And yet she's got over 50 million followers, and she's doing video tutorials about beauty. Of course, PewDiePie, YouTube and gaming. My son's a gamer, so I hear about this at naught and when he was little, all the way from Skyland, from Minecraft, to these other things. Now he doesn't want to talk to me. But kids nowadays are getting so much more comfortable being in front of the camera. And my son has been doing this for a long time. And I reminded him from being 5 or 6 years old. And I don't know how these kids can figure out technology so easy. I came home from work one day, and my son, this is long before we had all of these gaming tools, and he somehow was 5. And he was playing on the Xbox. He had the iPad sitting next to him, and he was Skyping with a kid in Calgary. I was like, how, you're 5, how did you figure this stuff out? And it's just like, he's like, well, it's not that hard, Mom. Like, it's really easy. So, I mean, like, it's, what happened? So the thing about these brands, these brand ambassadors, PewDiePie is one, some of them really stuck their foot in it too, right? The J. Paul, Logan Paul, I guess they're still brand ambassadors, even though I just roll my eyes at the stuff that they used to be doing. Like it's sort of that Jack ASS stuff out there, and it's just pushing the envelope for ridiculousness in some ways, right? But they parlayed it into a career. So how can you empower and educate through storytelling? And like Andrew mentioned, the Joe Rogan, he's parlayed himself into quite a nice little business, hasn't he? On Spotify, and creating a huge following based on storytelling. More often than not, he's also interviewing other people as well. So that probably can help you in your organization from a content perspective of interviewing some of your other colleagues, whether it's visual, whether it's auditory, whether you're just getting them to blog about something, can certainly help. The other part about turning people from, the brand, becoming brand ambassadors or brand advocates at your organization is, as marketers, do your best to really encourage people to reshare content. And if they're sharing it from the company page that's already pre-approved content, then they're not going to get into trouble. Of course, you probably all have, hopefully you do have social media policies at this point to sort of outline the do's and the don'ts, and the goods and the bads and the ugly. And people are really afraid, for the most part, of participating in social because they don't want to get their wrists slapped. So I think if you do encourage them to share content on their LinkedIn channels, even on their other social channels, just say, we really want you to be part of the conversation. We really want you to be inclusive with all of this information. We want your perspective. We want to showcase you on these channels. The best way for you to sort of mitigate any kind of really big risk is to really just say, just make sure you follow our channel and then share the posts from our channel to your other social networks. And then, of course, then you can get the exponential word of mouth marketing that social media is really known for as well. All right, and as I mentioned, you want to make sure that you are, you have a social media policy. In fact, I didn't bring any videos into presentation number one because I have 18,000 slides, but also because of technology, there's usually hiccups. But there is a great social media policy video from the Australian Air Force. It's a few years ago. The Australian Air Force is a really neat, they turned what is a boring social media policy and put it into a cute video that basically says, like, just whatever you do in your offline hours, you're still a brand representative of the organization. We want to empower you and educate you and include you in the conversation. We just don't want you to go off willy-nilly and do some really silly things. Your social media policy, of course, is going to outline how many people read those HR handbooks. I certainly never did when I was an employee. And so the video is actually really neat and fun, and just if you can make it so that it's entertaining, people will be more likely to watch it. 5-minute less video on these are the do's and the don'ts. As I said, it's the Australian Air Force video. I don't know how long ago it was out there, but anyway, so I just included this. I mean, this is the tough thing that I have with statistics is you can always have various statistics that'll tell you when's the best time to publish online, right? But you find another statistic and it'll completely negate the last statistic that told you that this was the best time to post online. Hopefully, as marketers, you're looking at your metrics and just finding out what works for your organization. But I guess as a rule of thumb, here's just a couple of them that I've done research on anyway. And then goals, right? So that's, therein sort of lies that it's like, if you don't set your goals, then you can't measure against them, right? Your marketers, just preaching to the choir here, right? Thinking about how many people do you want to reach? And as I said, really using and leveraging your employees on LinkedIn, on these other social channels. In fact, LinkedIn says that your staff are actually reach 10 times more people than your company page alone, because people want to engage with other people. So encourage them to share great content, right? And then just think about what success looks like. And from a brand resonance standpoint, some of you guys already probably know this, and it takes at least 11.4 touch points for any brand to start to build brand resonance. So it's that repeated exposure over and over again with your business brand and your personal brand of, are you showing up? Are you being consistent? Are you sharing content regularly? And so forth. And as I know, as a content manager, that's not always easy. Okay, I went through so quickly. I can breathe now. So you can probably go for lunch a little bit earlier, probably, right? I don't have the time here. I can see it on here. So just some final thoughts before I open the floor for any kinds of questions is, you think about building your personal brand, right? What is your unique value? What is the story that you want to share with your colleagues? Write for the reader. We often don't necessarily do this, particularly on our LinkedIn profiles, is writing for the reader. Who are you looking to impress? Who's the person you're looking to wow and person? Who are the people that you're looking to wow and impress? Get out of your own way and tell your story, because trust me, you have a lot of value that you bring to the table, and it's really important you tell your story. You think about building your audience. How are you connecting with your network? And again, back to LinkedIn a little bit. For me, it's about quality over quantity. I would rather connect with people that I know or I want to get to know than I do with people, say, florist in Ireland. I don't care about that person, the florist in Ireland, unless I met them in person when I'm on my travels or I don't really care about connecting with just everyone and anyone. I think one of the metrics that we look towards like vanity metrics, don't we? That, oh, if I have 15,000 followers or 20,000 followers, then that's going to really make a difference. To me, I think there's a fine line with that, because yeah, you might look impressive with having 20, 30,000 followers, but who really cares? Because you can buy those clicks, right? Then you just put a banks out there. So I would much rather build a network based on quality, who actually care about what I'm posting and actually stop scrolling what I'm posting, than I am just to have so many people that really couldn't care less about what I have to say. And so again, think about how you can build thought leadership within your own organization as well. As marketers, we're really championing that cause. We're really pushing that cause, sometimes uphill, of trying to get people involved in the conversation, and how you can turn your own team into brand ambassadors and advocates as well. And it's not always easy, but there are subtle ways to do that. And it's just telling each team member that you work with is that you have a unique perspective, you have value. And the introverts in the room are probably like, I don't even want to, because I know there's a lot of people who really don't like putting themselves out there. But I think, again, if you can make it into a fun sort of exercise where you're including them in the conversation, they're going to feel much more empowered of having a voice in your organization as well, right? It's all everything's, the popularization of diversity and inclusion. We want to include you in the conversation. It's not just about us talking at people anymore, it's talking with them. So again, nobody knows what you know from your perspective, and I think that's another important thing to include from your own personal brand and the brand of your colleagues and your teammates, right? It's encouraging them to say, like, listen, nobody knows, nobody's seen what you've seen through your lens, so we want to share that. We want to share these stories. I think a lot of the humanization of brands, I think that's where things are. I actually really love the shift that brands are becoming more human, because it's really hard to sort of push. It's hard to get people to really love the actual brand itself, but if you actually humanize it, the people behind it, the people who really love what they do, then it makes you feel more connected to that brand. So we're trying to get people from here into here, our base marketers. We're trying to get them to go, yeah, I like it. So like, how much I love this brand. Let me tell you why I love this brand so much. That's what we want to do as marketers. And it's again, like with Andrew saying, like, what was there one that was some kind of paste? To get people really excited about sharing about, what do you call it? Pardon? Solder paste. Yeah, that's such a weird thing to get people really motivated and excited about. So how can you get your women to do the same thing, right? All right, you can breathe now. I went 45 minutes, it was an hour to half hour, but then you guys get a longer lunch, I guess, at this point. Do you guys have any questions at this point? If you want to, you can download, I have the free digital workbook hopefully I have live. If not, you're going to have to email me. You can connect with me on LinkedIn using the QR code, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about LinkedIn, about branding, anything like that. I went so fast because I was worried that you guys are starving. So, hopefully, so are there any questions you guys may have? What's your name?
This was turned up from yesterday. When we're talking about building personal brand and producing content on thought leadership, particularly on LinkedIn, where you also are associated with your employer, how do you recommend balancing that maybe the thoughts that you are providing, say on work culture, is not inferred that you are speaking about your own organization, or if you're talking about best marketing tactics, you aren't criticized that your own organization isn't implementing those best marketing tactics?
Oh crap! That would be tough if your company's not implementing the best marketing. I think there's two schools of thought. Like, you can create your own content and you can curate content too. Right? You should be sharing other people's posts, and you might just. I think to answer your question, I think we're probably a lot more critical about ourselves in the way that we're going to be perceived than the fact that our audience or our network is actually going to go, well, wait a minute, stop right there. People are just so busy in their day, they're probably not going through and scrutinizing things to a certain extent. But I totally understand where you're coming from, because you want it, this is the best practice. And why is your organization following this best practice too, right? And does anybody else have any feedback on that? Because I think that would be that's a hard balance. to balance into, because who would be the people that would be criticizing, I guess would be my question. It probably would be outside people, would it? Or is it internal other people that are saying,
well, I suppose I have a bit of a unique situation. I work for an NHL team, so it's quite high profile. There's lots of fans that are quite passionate, and there's lots of articles written about it from the business side to the sports side. And if I want to talk about something that's important, an important content or a hot topic to build my personal brand, so I will use the example of workplace culture. There are a lot of people who love to scrutinize NHL teams and take advantage of any opportunity to do so. So I could see many people saying, oh, well, she's talking about this because maybe that's lacking at their organization. And obviously, there's got to be some sort of balance about talking about important hot topics and building your own personal brand, but also not necessarily putting it into the market that you may be reflecting that conversation about your own organization.
Perhaps, I'm just going to throw this out there, perhaps it could be something like, our best practice in marketing is this, what do you guys think? And then you're not really stating your own personal opinion about it, but just like, I just read this article that says blah, 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 blah. I'd love to hear what you guys think, and then just try to welcome the conversations that way. That might be the approach. And then you're not sort of like stating your place and which side of the argument you're on.
That's fair.
But welcoming people to join the conversation in a way. That's what I find when it comes to certain things that are controversial, is giving the forum to other people to give them a voice. And sometimes people are going to disagree with you. Actually, that's probably a good thing. It's certainly going to encourage engagement when people are pretty passionate about it one way or another. And you're not siding with one. Oh, thank you for your perspective. That's really interesting. So to let somebody know that they've been heard without actually saying, I agree with you or disagree with you on that. That's a possible way of doing it. Well, actually, it's an interesting discussion to have, because I know with my students, we were talking about celebrities and their brands and how athletes, the branding of athletes have, my students were like, well, it's not really fair for athletes to have to become role models, right? And that's a whole other discussion about that, because they're there to be the athlete, but yet they're a role model, and what are the consequences and the good, bad, and ugly about them being role models, whereas the difference between that and somebody else's celebrity have chosen that group. I don't know. It's an interesting discussion.
It is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Question there.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, one platform that when we think about building USP for brands and for individuals is Wikipedia.
Wikipedia?
I'd just like to know what's your view as to how to, is it worth considering as one of the platforms or options? What's your view?
It's an excellent question. Wikipedia, I think most people recognize as a very truthful tool for creating content. Now, I don't know, does anybody else have any experience with Wikipedia? Because I don't. I think I know there's a lady who's not used that experience with. Okay, so she can answer that question first. Because I think it's more up to date. Wikipedia is more up to date than, say, an encyclopedia. Anybody who remembers an encyclopedia, right? So but then you have to actually have third-party sources to validate that content. Is that right?
So there's contributions. So people who more or less, you have like a stream of people get notified when a change happens on the site, and so people come and they validate the source. So say for example, I've heard people kind of make Wikipedia sites that are for like a very niche market, but they don't have who validate it. So sometimes they'll send people to this direction and make them believe certain things. I've seen it as a trend on TikTok. People will go, and it takes about 24 hours for about people to observe this. So they'll say certain things like, in a different language, this means this, and they'll go on the Wikipedia change and point people that way. It'll go viral online and change the way people think about that. So that's kind of the nuance of Wikipedia itself. But it does have a whole community that kind of backs it. It's more voluntary than anything. And yeah, it's a great platform to get information, but you need to be able to source it. I think people rely on it too heavily as a front end to provide that, where it really does have that ability where people can change at their discretion.
Yeah, and to your point, I've never had experience actually creating or even submitting anything to a Wikipedia page myself. And I have heard that having a third-party source, you can kind Like it couldn't come from yourself, it had to come from someone else. I don't know how they validate that.
I once played prank back in I want to say about 2009 on the page about auras, like migraine auras. I started putting in there, I learned from my friend Sammer. So I put according to Sammer in there. And it probably took at that point, I want to say 2 weeks before people were like, who's Sammer? And this was, of course, 2009. Now there's a much bigger community taking care of it. So
Yeah. Are you like, is your question specifically about Wikipedia itself or just your wiki?
Wikipedia.
Sorry, yeah.
My question is more around how to, whether it should be a platform to consider when you think about building your personality, either for an individual or for a brand.
Oh, your own personal brand.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if you can do that. There was a way I started doing it. I did create on Google. I create, anything that I could do to sort of put my footprint into. I did on Google, I think, only because I wrote a book, and they have to validate that. So I don't know if you can create your own personal wiki.
So you could, yes, you can, or use the third party.
Pardon me?
You can, or you can use the third party. I think there are people who do that. My question really is whether it should be considered if you think.
I think anywhere you can spread out your brand is a good thing, particularly if you can get on Wikipedia, why not? I would absolutely do it if I could, because it is one of those trustworthy sites because it is a collaborative. That's the whole idea. Tim Berners-Lee created the internet or created the World Wide Web. It's really about inclusivity and collaboration and all that stuff. So if you can, I think why not? If it's just that's the importance of actually Googling your name because you'll see which sites are ranked the highest. LinkedIn, the research that I've done is LinkedIn will be one of the highest ranked sites typically. But it's interesting because have you ever heard of there's like a joke that says like where would you hide a dead body? The second page of the roll, right? So if Wikipedia is not one of those sites that sort of would appear, then I probably would bother. But I don't know too many personal brands that actually create it. So yeah, there's sort of one extra.
If you can collect references to you as a brand, so say you get content from several websites or anything along those lines, then you should be able to build it. So it's more or less being able to source the material from several different sites. Then at that point, you can, in essence, build your own Wikipedia page.
I think it's a value that people do have. I always trust Wikipedia more than I would trust almost any other channel out there insofar as like to validate content. When there's when there's something in the news that somebody has passed away or something like that, or people go on Wikipedia to see if, like the context of how is the profile written? Is it current? Is it past? Andrew, do you have any comments about Wikipedia at all?
Everyone is a keynote speaker. To make sure that his Wikipedia profile reflects who he is, what he's about, and so on. He's written books. So I wouldn't necessarily use it as I'd use it as a validation to your personal brand, but not my primary platform for my personal brand.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. Any other questions about any other stuff? Okay. Well, hopefully we'll connect. Hopefully you'll reach out to me on LinkedIn and on any of the other channels. I'm happy to provide any kind of context about what we talked about today. I will be sticking around, so if anybody wants to tackle me in the hallway.
So I could just share an observation on this particular point on Wikipedia.
Sure.
Maybe I need to be corrected. I mean, maybe Wikipedia is more in terms of a content station, and it's the other social platforms which make that content more and more viral. Would you say that? I mean, Wikipedia is more in terms of a storehouse of content,
Right.
where other platforms facilitate the virality of the information that's around.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree there?
I'm not sure I understand your comment. So where has the information?
No, because the Wikipedia as such, it's not a social media platform, right? So I mean, someone has some content, maybe it's personal branding or anything, and there it's a kind of a data warehouse, information warehouse, and you have the other platforms like Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, which typically ensure that if that particular content is worth the while, it could get to be more and more viral.
Yeah.
So I was talking more in terms of the synergies that these social media platforms have with, let us say, a platform like Wikipedia.
Right. Yeah. No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, from the virality standpoint, like you can't. Like, Wikipedia certainly would. I'd probably be more likely to invest my time creating my own brand website than I would Wiki myself. That's where I would spend my time is creating like a brand. If that's where I wanted to pursue my career as a standalone brand unto its own, it would be creating a website because I think the important thing that we have to remember about all these social different channels, to your point, is that you kind of have to be a member of those social media channels in order to see the content, with the exception of, say, the ones that you don't need to log into, like YouTube or like Wiki wouldn't necessarily be a two-way dialogue, but you usually have to be a member of those social media sites too, right? So I think there's pros and cons to building communities on those sites and getting the viral aspect of it, but then as we know, the channels are going to change over time too, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your input.